Alien Beast Woman Scout says she doesn't like me, but her tail always wrapped around my leg. Welcome to the world of science fiction. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The first thing Chester noticed after the crash was the taste of blood in his mouth and the overwhelming glow of violet sand reflecting a triple moon sky. His head throbbed from the impact, his left arm was torn up, and the control panel of his salvaging shuttle now lay twisted, half buried under crystalline dunes that looked almost beautiful if they didn't mean he was stranded on a blacklisted planet. Viarch 3 wasn't on any travel guide, its atmosphere barely breathable, its terrain hostile, and its locals known only through whispered rumors and outdated logs. His only objective had been to trace a distress signal linked to a lost Earth fleet, something his superiors said was a wild goose chase. But Chester had instincts, and they told him something was buried out here. Now, instead of unearthing a fortune, he was sitting in jagged sand with a half-working oxygen filter and blood running down his brow. He wasn't alone for long. A low growl, steady, confident, and definitely female, came from above the ridge. Chester twisted, his good hand reaching for the emergency flare gun strapped to his hip, but it was too late. A tall silhouette stepped into view, lit from behind by the setting moons. She was unlike any creature he'd seen before, furred in lavender gray, limbs lean but powerful, with glowing purple eyes and two massive upright ears twitching like antennae. Her armor was practical, layered heat traps, a weather-worn Scout's played over her chest, and a long fur-lined tail that flicked behind her with impatience. Sand goggles rested on her forehead, and in one clawed hand she held what looked like a spear with a plasma tip, the other hovering near a holstered blade. "Human," she said, her voice rough like it hadn't been used in days. "Why are you here?" Chester wiped his face with his sleeve, trying not to flinch. Crash landed, not here by choice. She sniffed the air like she could tell he was lying but didn't press. Instead, she paced closer, circling him, measuring. Her tail brushed over his boot once, an accident maybe, but it didn't move away. She crouched and examined his shuttle wreck with an almost scientific curiosity, then looked him over again. Her eyes narrowed. "You're bleeding." "Not badly. You'll be dead by nightfall if you stay in that wreck." She stood up and turned. "Get up." He pushed himself to his feet slowly, teeth clenched from pain. "You offering help, or just leading me to the edge of a cliff to finish the job?" "If I wanted you dead," she said without looking back. "You'd be dead already." She didn't offer a name. She didn't ask for his. Just started walking and he followed, limping through the violet dunes, the strange sand clinging to his boots like it was half magnetic. The landscape shimmered under the moons, casting refracted light that bounced off the crystal formations in every direction. Beautiful, yes, but it meant no shadows, no cover, a placement to expose everything, just like her. After what felt like an hour of silence, Chester finally broke it. "You got a name, or am I supposed to just call you Scout?" She didn't turn around. "Grace." He blinked. "That's unexpected." She stopped so suddenly, he nearly bumped into her. "I didn't choose it. It's a translation your kind put into the trade files after first contact. Our actual names don't map well to your language. I kept this one because it annoyed my handler." Chester chuckled. "I like it already." Her ears twitched again, not quite a smile, but not entirely neutral either. She resumed walking, a little slower now, perhaps noticing his struggle to keep up. As night deepened, the temperature dropped fast. Grace led them to a shallow cave half buried under a curved rock ledge. The interior shimmered with crystalline veins, casting soft light that made his wounds look worse than they felt. She knelt beside him, pulled a canister from her satchel, and sprayed his injured arm with a biophone that hissed but sealed the gash instantly. Her hands were rough but efficient, clearly used to field triage. Chester tried not to react when her claw tips brushed his skin. "You're lucky I was on patrol," she muttered. "Are you?" he asked. "Lucky, I mean." Her eyes met his with an intensity that was hard to read. No. She turned away and set up a motion trigger perimeter with tiny sonar mines she embedded into the cave walls. Chester leaned back, watching her in silence. She moved like someone used to solitude, but also like someone who wasn't used to being ignored. That tail of hers twitched again, brushing against his ankle this time, then again, looping once lightly. He glanced down and raised an eyebrow. She didn't acknowledge it. "You cold?" she asked, adjusting a thermal tarp between them. "No, you're shivering." "Not from the cold." That earned him a sharp look, but not an insult. She sighed and lay beside him on the tarp, pulling her own cloak over her shoulders. Chester let the silence stretch. Eventually, the wind outside died down and he thought she'd fallen asleep until she shifted closer, just slightly. Her tail, already half wrapped around his calf, slid up and coiled gently around his thigh. He didn't move. He didn't say a word, just stared at the cave ceiling, a tiny smile tugging at his lips. After a few minutes, he risked a glance. Her eyes were closed, her breathing steady, but those large ears still twitching. He whispered, "Grace, you sure you don't like humans?" No answer, just a tiny, almost subconscious squeeze of her tail. Chester closed his eyes, let himself relax, and thought, this mission just got a lot more complicated. The desert sun rose too fast and burned too bright, casting jagged reflections across the violet dunes that made Chester squint as he climbed out of the cave. His arm ached under the biofoam, and his boots were already half filled with shimmering sand. Grace stood a few meters ahead, scanning the horizon with her ears perked and arms crossed. She hadn't spoken a word since he woke up, but the way she tossed a ration bar toward him without even turning said enough. She was still playing the part of reluctant guide, pretending this was all for her own survival, but Chester wasn't fooled. Last night had made it clear there was more going on under her rough, grumbling surface. Her tail had stayed wrapped around him until just before dawn, and now she was acting like that meant nothing. He didn't push it, not yet. She was still a mystery, but one he was starting to enjoy unraveling. He bit into the ration and winced. Sand had found its way into everything, including the food. "So, how far is this outpost of yours?" he asked, brushing grit from his teeth. Grace didn't look at him. 3 days if you don't slow me down." That's a hell of a vote of confidence. She finally turned, eyes sharp, but not cruel. "I didn't say you would slow me down. I said if." That was the closest thing to a compliment he'd gotten since meeting her. He let it hang in the air for a moment, then shouldered the makeshift pack she'd helped him throw together. The walk began in silence, boots crunching against glassy dunes that shifted with each step. The triple moons now just faded outlines in the lightning sky. Every so often, Grace would stop to sniff the air, scan the ridgelines, or press her claws against a half-buried stone etched with old markings. Chester watched how her demeanor shifted in these moments, more alert, more focused, like a soldier waiting for ambush. He started matching her pace without being told, keeping a half step behind so she could lead. She didn't thank him, but she also didn't complain. That was progress. By midday, the heat had risen to blistering levels. Chester's head felt like it was baking inside his helmet, and even Grace had loosened her armor plates and rolled her sleeves up. Her lavender-gray fur shimmered with a faint sheen of sweat, and the sand stuck to it in patches, dulling the glow of the swirling tattoos that marked her arms. Chester tried not to stare, but the way she moved, efficient, powerful, graceful in spite of the harsh terrain, made it hard to look away. She noticed, of course. "You're not subtle," she said without glancing back. "Never claimed I was." "And what do you think you're seeing?" He raised an eyebrow, a very capable scout with no sense of humor, and a tail that has trouble staying in its own space. That made her pause, just a flicker of a smirk at the corner of her mouth. Then she kept moving. "You'll lose that leg if you keep talking." "I'll take my chances." They continued in silence until the ground shifted beneath them, not with tremors but sound, low, distant, rhythmic. Grace raised a hand and crouched, her ears twitching. Chester followed her lead, crouching behind a jagged dune crest. Below, a caravan of rusted hoverbikes coasted between crystal outcroppings, black banners flapping behind them, and riders covered in scavenged armor marked with red scorch paint. Raiders. Grace's lip curled in disgust. Scav cults, she whispered. Syndicate-fed, they strip old battle sites and trade parts for tech or slaves. Chester narrowed his eyes. Do they patrol this route often? Too often they must have picked up the shuttle wreck on their scanners. She looked at him serious now. If they find it, they'll know you're here, and if they saw the crash, they'll look for survivors. Then we need to keep moving. Grace nodded, already sliding back down the ridge. They traveled faster now, diverting into a narrow canyon where the heat was no less brutal, but the visibility was better. They kept close to the walls, climbing over eroded stones and ducking beneath jutting crystal spears. Chester's breathing grew ragged, but he didn't complain. Every time he stumbled, he caught himself. Every time the pain spiked, he gritted through it. Grace noticed, even if she didn't say anything. Once she slowed enough to steady him with a clawed hand, her grip firm and warm against his shoulder, and didn't pull away right away. "You've got nerve," she muttered as they reached a shaded crevice and took cover. "I've got reasons," he said, lowering himself against the cool stone. Grace sat beside him, pulling out a canteen. She drank, then passed it to him without a word. Their arms brushed. Her tail flicked once, then rested lightly against his boot again, like it had a mind of its own. Chester drank and leaned his head back. "You really think we'll make it in 3 days?" She nodded, "if the storm doesn't hit early." "What storm?" "Big one cycles through every 7 nights. Crystalline winds tear the skin from bones." He grimaced, "And you didn't mention this sooner because complaining won't make it arrive any slower, and you didn't ask." He laughed despite the threat. "You always this charming." "No," she said. "You just bring out the worst in me." He looked at her sideways. "You sure it's not the best?" She didn't answer, but she didn't move away either. By nightfall, they set up another small camp tucked beneath a curved rock face. Grace lit a low-heat crystal that provided warmth without drawing attention. Chester tried not to show how much his legs ached as he settled on the sand. Grace busied herself checking gear, but her movements had slowed too. She was tired, even if she'd never admit it. He noticed her tail had once again found his boot and was resting there like it belonged. He raised an eyebrow and tapped it lightly. "You do realize this thing has its own love language, right?" She shot him a glare, then sighed and lay down beside him, head propped on one arm. "Its instinct means nothing." "Sure, and I crash-landed here just to admire the view." She gave him a look. "You're not as funny as you think. And you're not as cold as you pretend." They stared at each other for a moment too long. Then she turned over and muttered something he didn't quite catch. The wind outside howled low, carrying distant echoes across the canyon. Chester closed his eyes and felt the soft weight of her tail slide from his boot to curl lightly over his ankle. He smiled and said nothing. Whatever she was pretending, her instincts were writing a different story, and he was willing to take the long route to find out where it led. By the time the second day began, Chester had learned not to question the rhythm of Grace's movements. She was up before the first moonlight faded from the sky, already tightening the wraps around her armor and repacking their supplies with methodical precision. There was no gentle wake-up call, no conversation, only the crunch of boots in sand and the faint glow of her thermal cloak draped over her shoulders as she waited silently by the canyon mouth. Chester groaned as he sat up, muscles protesting, but he didn't complain. The biofoam held and his arm wasn't bleeding anymore, which counted as a win. He stood stretched and joined her without a word, nodding the faint twitch of her ears as he approached. She'd heard every move he made, probably even his heartbeat through the night, and yet she hadn't walked away. If anything, the tail had wrapped tighter like it needed something from him her mouth wouldn't admit. They marched again through endless dunes, now steeper, carved by ancient wind patterns into twisting ridges and jagged valleys. Occasionally they passed the remains of long-dead machinery, shattered drone husks, half-buried transport skiffs, and rusted weapon turrets fused into the crystalline ground. Grace avoided each one with purpose, sometimes spitting near them like they carried disease. Chester finally asked why, and she answered without stopping. "Relax from the betrayal," she said. "When humans and beastkin were allies briefly, your kind built bases here during the Syndicate Wars, then pulled out and left us exposed. We were hit in the retreat, thousands dead, the sand remembers." Chester frowned. "I thought the Syndicate hit everyone. Earth barely kept their colonies." "True, but Earth retreated. We bled. It wasn't said with venom, just fact, like a scar that had long since closed but still ached when the weather turned." Chester didn't offer excuses or apologies. He wasn't there, didn't sign the orders, and he wasn't going to insult her by pretending guilt was the same as loss. Instead, he walked beside her and listened, the crunch of their boots the only other sound in the heavy desert silence. After a while, Grace glanced sideways, then spoke again, softer this time. "My sister died in one of the last raids. She was a scout, too, better than me, smarter. She kept trying to bridge the gap with your kind, even when Command told her not to bother. She believed there could still be peace. What happened? Friendly fire. A human gunship mistook her for Syndicate. By the time they checked the tags, her head was gone." Chester felt his chest tight. He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. Instead, he reached over slowly and rested a hand on her arm just briefly. Grace didn't pull away. She didn't respond either, but her tail brushed his calf again, not coiling this time, just a soft, passing touch that lingered like a whisper. She blinked hard and picked up the pace. They reached a dune crest by midday and paused to scan the horizon. In the distance, black smoke rose from where Chester's wrecked shuttle had been. Grace raised a scope to her eye and muttered a low curse. "Raiders found it. They'll backtrace your entry vector. They'll know we're heading to the outpost." "How many?" "Too many to fight." "Then we don't fight," Chester said. "We beat them there." Grace looked at him long and hard, searching for sarcasm or fear. Finding neither, she gave a single nod. "Then we don't stop again until sunset." The next hours blurred into one long, punishing march. They skipped water breaks, moved through exposed plains without cover, and bypassed resting caverns Grace had previously marked on her holomap. Chester forced his legs to move, jaw clenched tight, the sun turning his helmet interior into an oven. Grace began to shed parts of her outer armor, revealing the tightly fitted bodysuit beneath, its surface gleaming with subtle, heat-reactive lines that shifted with her movement. She didn't seem to care that Chester saw it now, no longer acting like he was some wandering fool. In truth, he was. He'd served in recon years ago before switching to salvage. He knew how to push his body, how to ration adrenaline, and how to read someone's posture. And Grace, her eyes stopped narrowing when she looked at him. She didn't need to squint anymore to see what he was made of. As twilight fell, they found another narrow canyon, this one steeper, darker, with narrow walls that allowed only slivers of moonlight. Grace led them into it carefully, sending the air every few meters until they reached a bend that opened into a wind-sheltered alcove. It wasn't a cave, but the rocks formed a half roof and reflected body heat well enough to make it passable for rest. Chester collapsed beside the nearest boulder, breathing hard. Grace lowered herself across from him, crouched in a half-squat, eyes scanning the ridge behind them for signs of movement. "They'll catch our trail by morning," she said. "Then we move again at first light." She nodded but didn't rise. Instead, she reached into her satchel and pulled out a narrow metal case. When she opened it, a soft chime played, a melody with no lyrics, just mournful tones that echoed softly between the canyon walls. Grace's eyes softened. Chester didn't speak, just watched, letting the sound settle into the moment. "My sister recorded that," she said finally. "She'd play it on long patrols, said it kept her from feeling alone. I used to hate it now. I need it." "It's beautiful," he said. She smiled faintly, and for the first time it wasn't strained or half-hidden. Then her expression turned thoughtful, almost reluctant. "You asked me before if I had a name. My real one, not the translation. You want to hear it?" He nodded. "Yeah, I do." She closed her eyes and whispered a sound, one that didn't quite fit into any earth syllables. It was melodic, clipped, and ended with a soft throat click. When she opened her eyes again, she seemed almost embarrassed. "You can't say it." "I don't need to. I'll stick with Grace." She rolled her eyes but didn't argue. Then, with almost no transition, she moved to lie beside him, close enough that her arm brushed his. Her tail again found his leg, but this time it didn't pretend to be accidental. It looped once, then twice before settling there like it belonged. Chester didn't comment on it, just rested his hand near hers, not touching, but close. The music box played on, and somewhere above, the third moon rose, casting silver light across the canyon. Grace turned her head slightly. "You're not like the others. And you're not nearly as terrifying as you pretend." Her ears twitched. "Liar." He smiled. "Maybe, but I'm a persistent liar." She huffed, not quite a laugh, but close, and then, without warning, she leaned over and pressed her forehead to his, eyes closing just for a second. When she pulled back, she didn't explain. She didn't need to. They fell asleep to the echo of old music and the quiet understanding that tomorrow might be worse, but tonight was theirs. Dawn broke with a whisper, not a blaze. The pale violet hue of early morning blanketed the canyon as a dry wind sifted fine crystals down from the overhang above. Chester stirred first, his body sore but alert, eyes drawn instantly to the warmth pressed against his side. Grace hadn't moved much during the night. Her tail was still coiled around his leg, firmer now, almost possessive, and her ears twitched slightly even in sleep, catching distant echoes like a living radar. Chester didn't move at first, didn't want to. There was something unspoken about these mornings that made them feel heavier than they should, like time had slowed just enough for the silence to matter. When he finally sat up, careful not to jostle her too much, her eyes blinked open immediately, sharp and aware as if she'd never truly slept. She didn't speak. Neither did he. She uncurled her tail and stretched with a low growl in her throat that wasn't meant to be threatening, just real. They moved out quickly, eating on the march, the canyon walls narrowing as the terrain became rougher. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was charged, filled with everything they didn't need to say again. Grace had let him in, not fully, not completely, but far enough that her mask had slipped. Chester had no intention of shoving past that line too fast. He walked beside her with quiet respect, only occasionally glancing over when she climbed or crouched or scanned the horizon with that intense glare that made him both wary and weirdly proud. She wasn't just surviving, she was leading, and not once had she treated him like dead weight. They were equals now, even if she still didn't say it out loud. By midday, they reached the edge of a vast basin. Below, the shimmering surface of an old dry lake reflected the light like glass. Half-buried bones of machines and creatures lay scattered like monuments to a war long forgotten. Grace hissed under her breath and crouched low. Chester followed her lead, his heart already sinking. At the far end of the basin, black flags fluttered from a line of sand-anchored bikes. Raider scouts. 4, maybe 5 of them helmets low, weapons strapped lazily across their backs, standing near a half-unearthed transport panel that must have fallen from the skis decades ago. They hadn't seen them yet, but they would if Chester and Grace tried to cross directly. Grace studied them, then nodded toward the ridge path curling eastward. "It'll take longer, but we avoid the kill zone." Chester looked at the terrain. "They're lazy, overconfident. If we wait till they circle for water, we can sneak across in the blind spot." She shot him a look, not of disbelief, but assessment. Risky. "We're running out of time. If we take the ridge and another group finds the outpost first, we're done." She hesitated, then gave a sharp nod. "We move on your count." It felt strange being trusted like that. Chester had spent most of his career being underestimated, by text, by scouts, by commanders who saw a salvage rat, not a tactician. Grace didn't. She watched him crouch, study the angle of the shadows, and wait until the moment was perfect. Just as two of the scouts mounted their bikes and roared off in opposite directions, dust clouds trailing behind them, the other three began to pull gear from a buried crate, distracted and loud. Now, Chester whispered. They slipped down the base and edge like shadows, sticking close to dune crests and using jutting debris for cover. Grace moved with silent precision, claws never snagging, tail twitching for balance. Chester followed a few paces behind, heartbeat steady, breath shallow. They reached a shattered freighter hull half buried in the glass and waited as another bike thundered past just meters away, its rider laughing at something over his helmet mic. When the dust settled, they sprinted the final leg, diving behind a collapsed engine before ducking into a narrow ravine that carved beneath the far ridge. They didn't stop moving for half an hour, pushing until the basin was behind them and the shimmer of heat distortion swallowed the raiders from view. Only then did Grace finally slow, panting slightly, sweat gleaming along her jaw. Chester leaned against a boulder, catching his breath. "You were right," she said between breaths. "That worked." Chester gave a tired grin. "You sound surprised." "I'm not." She looked at him. Really looked, just impressed. He didn't reply. Didn't need to. The heat between them was enough. No words could add to it. She turned away, but her tail flicked behind her again, lightly brushing his boot before curling toward the trail like it had its own opinion on everything. The outpost ridge came into view just before sunset, a spire of worn metal and rock nestled between two jagged cliffs. It looked abandoned, silent, no lights, no movement. Grace stiffened immediately, her ears flattening against her skull. "This isn't right." Chester unslung his scanner and swept the horizon. No energy readings, no biosigns, nothing but the hum of the wind and the faint buzz of exposed wiring on the outpost gate. Grace moved first, climbing the ridge wall and leaping to a ledge with feline ease. Chester followed more slowly, grabbing onto rusted grips and broken rails until they reached the main gate. Grace touched the access panel. It sparked. Dead. "Power out," she muttered. "Shouldn't be. This place has a backup generator tied to geothermal vents. Could be sabotage. Could be worse." They climbed through a maintenance hatch at the side, dropping into the inner courtyard. It was a mess. Supplies scattered, comms dish smashed, drag marks in the dust like someone had been pulled. Grace crouched by one of the stains, sniffing. "Recent," she said. "Too recent." Signs of a fight. No blood, just removal. Chester looked around, uneasy. "You said your commanding officer was stationed here." Grace didn't answer. She was already moving toward the command console inside the central structure. She flipped open a side panel and began hot-wiring the backup relay. Sparks flew. Chester stepped in, gently sliding beside her to help bypass a blown fuse. "I've got the circuit," he said. "I've got the override." Together they rewired it. The lights flickered, once, then held. The console came online with a distorted chime. Grace tapped into the logs. What they saw next wasn't a message. It was a warning, a scrambled last broadcast from the base commander, clearly panicked. Syndicate glyphs in the background. A flash of an alien insignia Chester hadn't seen in years. Grace's voice came low and dangerous. They were here, inside the outpost. This wasn't a raid. It was an execution. Chester swallowed hard. Why go to that effort for a dead outpost? Grace looked at him, her eyes glowing faintly. "Because it's not just about what's here. It's about what's buried underneath." Her tail wrapped tight around his leg again. This time it wasn't by accident. Something was coming and now they were both standing in its shadow, together. Outpost didn't creak. It hummed. A deep subterranean hum that made the floors feel alive beneath their boots, pooling just low enough to unsettle the nerves. Chester stood beside Grace, staring at the half-decrypted warning log now looping on the cracked command console. The base commander had tried to lock something down, had failed, and whatever got in left no blood, just silence and stripped data. That wasn't standard raider behavior. Raiders didn't clean up. They stole, scavenged, bragged. This was surgical. The syndicate had been here, not with bombs or bullets, but with intent. Grace scrolled past more corrupted logs, her jaw clenched tight, every muscle coiled like she was ready to spring. Chester didn't ask if she recognized the glyphs. He could tell by the way her fur bristled that she did. He moved to the window, scanning the perimeter again. The outpost was quiet, the wind outside just beginning to rise, carrying with it the fine, crystalline dust that painted everything in a dull shimmer. A sandstorm was building on the horizon, not the worst he'd seen, but enough to bury them if they didn't find solid cover. He glanced at the shattered stairwell leading below the command level. "What's down there?" he asked. Grace didn't look up. Old storage, cold rooms, vaults built before the retreat. Could that be where they came in? She paused, then finally nodded. Maybe, but if they're still down there. Then we finished what they started. That got her attention. She turned sharply, eyes locked on his. "You're not a soldier anymore." "No, but I still know how to finish a job." She stared for a long moment before finally nodding. "Then we check it together." They moved quickly, descending the broken stairwell one cautious step at a time. Dust coated everything, thick enough to swallow sound. The light strip still pulsed faintly along the walls, flickering with low battery warnings. Grace led with her plasma spear raised, Chester with a compact torch in one hand and a sidearm in the other. The deeper they went, the more the air changed. Cooler, stale, touched with the faint metallic tang of old circuitry and something fouler beneath it. They passed sealed crates marked in both human and beast conscript, then empty ones with scorched lids. The hallway opened into a small operations bay, the centerpiece being a sealed vault door with a damaged keypad. Chester stepped forward, wiping dust from the display. "Looks like it's fused." Grace kneeled beside him, claws tapping lightly as she examined the edge of the locking mechanism, forced open, then welded shut from the inside. Someone didn't want this opening again. He opened his pack and pulled out a toolkit. Too bad we're not someone. It took them 20 minutes to bypass the locks. Grace held the door steady while Chester rerouted power from a backup conduit and bypassed the external failsafe. When the door finally groaned open, it released a gust of cold air that smelled like ozone and dust, and something far older. Inside was a chamber lined with obsolete cryotanks, at least 24, all empty. One still flickered, its monitor cracked, the figure inside long removed. Grace stared at it with a haunted look. "I know this place. My sister was stationed here before she was transferred. She said they were experimenting crossbreeding tech and biology, dream-sharing interfaces, memory shells." Chester scanned the room. Experimental biotech, that's why the syndicate came, not for a fight for data. "And test subjects," Grace said darkly. "There were more logs here, embedded into the vault system." Chester cracked one open and began scrolling. He read quickly, eyes narrowing as the pieces clicked together. Human and beastkin scientists working in secret, creating neural compression models for rapid combat learning, trying to turn recruits into veterans overnight. But the experiments hadn't stayed contained. The final logs spoke of neural bleed, hallucinations, combat instincts leaking into dreams, even shared emotions between subjects. There had been side effects, some irreversible. Grace clenched her fists. They weaponized instinct. Chester nodded, and someone picked up the pieces. She moved away, staring down the line of tanks, her body taut with memory. "My sister was part of this program. She said she saw things in her dreams, someone watching, something speaking in code no one could translate." He stepped up behind her. "You think the syndicate's using it now?" "I think they perfected it." That explained the surgical extraction, the silence, the missing data. Not just a cover-up, this was acquisition. The syndicate hadn't destroyed the research. They'd taken it, refined it, and erased the witnesses. Grace turned toward him, eyes sharp now with purpose. "We have to destroy what's left. If there's even a fragment of code in here, they'll use it to control every beastkin who still carries compatible DNA markers." Chester nodded grimly. "We torch the vault." They planted charges from Grace's kit, set timers, and pulled the vault door closed behind them. As they ascended back to the command level, the storm outside had reached full strength. The wind howled against the outer shell of the outpost, and fine sand trickled through every crack and seam. The outer lights flickered to life automatically, casting beams into the swirling chaos. Chester sealed the lower level as the charges counted down. When they went off, the explosion was dull and deep, shaking the foundation but not breaching the upper structure. The vault had collapsed inward, burying everything inside under tons of fused metal and rock. Grace stood near the console, watching the seismic readings flatten. Her tail flicked sharply behind her. "It's done." Chester exhaled, then turned to her. "What now?" She didn't answer immediately, just walked over slowly until they stood toe-to-toe. The storm raged behind them, wind slamming against reinforced windows, but inside everything was quiet. Her ears twitched once, and then she reached up, resting a clawed hand lightly on his chest. "Now," she said softly, "you come with me. There's another outpost, one still active. If we warn them, if we deliver the fragments we did recover, we can stop this." He nodded once. "I'm with you." Her eyes softened slightly, though her voice stayed steady. "Even if they try to separate us, even if Command doesn't trust you." "They don't have to trust me, you do." Her expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable, and for the first time she leaned in and pressed her forehead against his like she had before, but this time longer. Her tail slid around his leg again, tighter now, deliberate, no more pretending, no more excuses. They stood like that for a moment that outlasted the wind, the storm, and the ghosts of what this place used to be. Then, without another word, they gathered their gear, sealed the outpost behind them, and stepped into the rising storm together. The storm was a beast with no shape, no face, only sound and pressure. Wind screamed through the jagged desert like a banshee, lifting crystalline sand into spiraling waves that scraped against armor and skin like razors. Grace led the way, eyes narrowed behind sand goggles, her movements confident even as the storm tried to knock her sideways. Chester stayed close behind, keeping a hand near the tattered scarf tied around his neck to protect his mouth, the rest of his body wrapped in a thermal cloak that did little to stop the sting. They weren't talking anymore. They couldn't. Words would have been torn away by the wind before they left the tongue, but they didn't need to speak. Grace would glance back every few minutes, tail flicking as if counting his steps, and Chester would nod or give a thumbs up, just enough to say, "I'm still here." They moved in tandem now, two bodies that had adjusted to the same rhythm, one heartbeat apart, no wasted energy. They followed a path that only Grace could see, etched into the landscape by years of patrols and tribal memory, down through a narrow crevice where the sand roared overhead but didn't reach, across broken terrain lit only by the occasional flash of electric discharge in the sky, like dry lightning had gotten lost and come hunting. The outpost was behind them now, buried in the storm, but Chester still felt the weight of what they'd done. The data was gone, the vault destroyed, but the threat remained. Someone out there still had the code, and if that someone was Syndicate, if they were planning to use it again, the war wasn't over. Not really, it had just changed masks. By nightfall, the storm had thinned. It never stopped, not completely, but it softened into gusts and drifting silence. The stars returned, faint behind dust clouds, and the triple moons glowed low on the horizon like ghostly sentinels. Grace led them to a collapsed transport vehicle, half buried and tilted sideways against a ridge. She popped the emergency hatch and ducked inside. Chester followed, thankful for the sudden absence of wind. The interior was cramped, the air metallic and stale, but the structural integrity held. Grace dropped her pack, unwrapped her heat wraps, and finally pulled the sand goggles off her head. Her fur was matted with dust. The glowing tattoos along her arms dimmed under layers of grit. She shook her ears once, then turned to him, silently watching. Chester sank down on a broken crate and exhaled hard. "You ever stop moving?" "Only when it's safe," she said. "We're safe now." Temporary safety is still a delay. not a solution. He smiled faintly, unwrapping his own cloak and brushing sand from his shoulders. "You always this intense." Grace moved to sit across from him, tail curling around one of the metal support bars like it was anchoring her. "I can't afford not to be. You're still new to this desert. It doesn't care about your intentions. And you do." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned back against the wall, arms folded, her glowing eyes fixed on him with that calculating, unreadable gaze. Then, almost grudgingly, she said, "You've lasted longer than I expected." "Is that your way of saying you're impressed again?" "It's my way of saying I was wrong." Chester tilted his head. "About what?" "About humans. About you." That stopped him. He didn't joke, didn't try to brush it off. He just met her eyes and let the weight of the moment settle between them like a third presence. Grace's tail twitched once, then slowly coiled toward him, brushing along his boot and pausing there like it was testing the space. "You didn't have to stay in that outpost," she said. "You could have waited for extraction. Let me handle it." "I know. So why didn't you?" Chester leaned forward, elbows on his knees, voice steady. "Because I've seen what it looks like when people walk away. I'm not built for that. You needed someone to back you up. I wanted it to be me." Her ears flattened slightly, not in anger but in something like vulnerability. That mask of sarcasm and sharp edges she wore so well flickered for a second, revealing the weight beneath. She shifted forward, her knees brushing his, and the tail slid higher, curling around his shin now with deliberate slowness. "You shouldn't get attached," she whispered. "This path leads nowhere good." "Too late for that," Chester replied. He reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and placed a hand on hers. Her claws didn't flex, her fingers didn't resist. She let him hold it, eyes locked to his, the tension in her body slowly unwinding. For a moment, neither moved. Then she leaned in, not fast, not dramatic, just enough to close the gap and kiss him. It wasn't long, it wasn't fierce. It was quiet and acknowledgement, a promise not yet spoken aloud. When she pulled back, she didn't explain or apologize. She didn't need to. Chester exhaled. "I've had worse days." Grace almost smiled, and worse company, not even close. They settled against the wall together, her head resting lightly on his shoulder, his hand on her knee, the warmth between them a contrast to the cold metal around them. The wind outside rose again, but inside it couldn't touch them. For the first time since crashing on this godforsaken planet, Chester felt something like peace. After a long pause, Grace spoke again. "The next outpost isn't far. Half a day if we keep pace. And if they've already been hit, then we adapt. We find another." "You ever get tired of fighting uphill?" She glanced up at him, one brow raised. "You haven't figured it out yet. This is the only way I know how to climb." He laughed quietly. "Then I guess I better keep up." "You're learning," she said, and finally, without the edge, she smiled. A real one this time. They slept light bodies close, weapons within reach, but the silence was no longer oppressive. The darkness was no longer empty. They weren't alone anymore, not in the fight, not in the night, and not in the growing pull between them. And somewhere beyond the desert, deeper in the stars, something watched their progress. Unseen, unnamed, but not untouched. Not anymore. The desert was merciless the next morning. Windswept dunes had reshaped the landscape overnight, erasing footprints, trail markers, and even the half-buried equipment Grace had left behind months ago. Chester rose before first light, dusting the sand off his jacket and quietly checking their remaining gear. Grace was already moving, stretching in a low crouch near the broken hatch, her silhouette outlined against the moon still hanging low in the sky. She said nothing, but when she caught his eye, she gave the briefest of nods, not as a greeting but an agreement. They were still in this together. Chester joined her without a word, and together they resumed their journey through the violet dust with only the crunch of boots and the whine of shifting dunes to accompany them. By midday, the terrain flattened into a long expanse of cracked mineral plates, each one glowing faintly under the heat of the sun. Grace moved with more caution now, her ears twitching frequently, tails stiff behind her. Chester recognized the signs. They were getting close to something, maybe the next outpost or maybe something far worse. He didn't ask. She would speak when she was ready, and until then he stayed sharp, one hand never straying far from the compact weapon on his bell. They moved around a jagged cluster of solar pylons, long dead, their panels shattered and scorched. Grace stopped beside a toppled one and crouched low, running a clawed finger over the metal, her eyes narrowed. "Tracks," she muttered. "Fresh." Chester followed her gaze. The marks weren't obvious not to someone untrained, but he saw them now. Indentations where boots had sunk deeper into softened ground, the faint curve of something heavy dragged behind. Grace stood and scanned the horizon. They came through here fast. Light packs, no wheels. "On foot?" Chester asked. They were running. He didn't like that. Raiders didn't run. Syndicate units didn't run unless they had a reason. Grace adjusted her goggles and pointed to a distant outcrop just barely visible through the heat shimmer. "The relay outpost is there, 5 clicks. Do we go around?" "No time. If they're ahead of us, they've already hit it." They moved faster now, covering ground at a punishing pace, sweat running down Chester's spine, boots grinding into sharp stone. Grace was quiet but not cold, focused. Occasionally she'd glance back and check that he was still close. The 5th time she did it, he just gave her a look. She didn't check again after that. As they neared the outcrop, the wind shifted, carrying the bitter scent of scorched plastic and coolant. Chester slowed. Grace didn't. The relay station was small, little more than a dome built into the rock with 2 signal towers and a perimeter fence of long, dead turrets. Smoke curled from a shattered panel near the entrance. Grace drew her spear and signaled for Chester to move wide. He circled the side, crouched low, pulse steady. The moment he reached the north antenna, he froze. A body hung from it, beastkin, armor blackened, eyes wide open and glassy. Not fresh, not completely cold either. Grace appeared beside him seconds later. Her face didn't change, but her tail curled inward tightly. She reached up and closed the soldier's eyes, then removed a small chain from the neck and tucked it into her belt. "They were trying to broadcast," she said. Chester moved to the relay console near the door. The screen was shattered, but the internal drive looked intact. He pulled a bypass module from his bag and began tapping commands. The console hummed, then flickered to life with a single, uncorrupted log. "Emergency uplink, Tier 4 code. Subject Ghostskin Protocol. Operator Sergeant Viren Jax. Final message. If anyone's hearing this, the Syndicate's not just harvesting tech. They're testing control. Remote neural override, it works. I saw it. My own squad gone in seconds. We're compromised. The log cut out with static, then silence. Chester swore under his breath. "They've cracked it. Full neural domination." Grace didn't blink. That's why they needed the outpost vault. The prototypes weren't memory shells. They were keys. Chester stood, his mind racing, and if they've started distributing the override command, they won't stop with soldiers. They'll spread it through dream threads, through relay nodes, anything with the right frequency. Grace turned toward the horizon, jaw clenched. "This isn't war, it's assimilation." Chester paced. "So what's next? We can't stop a broadcast that doesn't exist yet." "No," she said, "but we can stop the source." He turned. "You know where it's coming from?" Grace hesitated, then finally nodded. "There's an ancient temple, old tech buried in the heart of this desert. Not ours. Older. The Syndicate uncovered it years ago. I didn't think they found the central node, but now I know they did." Chester didn't hesitate. "Then take me there." Grace stepped closer, lowering her voice. "It's dangerous. The kind of place even my elders won't walk near. The tech in that temple doesn't just interact with memory. It stores instinct, emotion, fear. It could tear you apart. Then we'll walk carefully." She studied him for a long moment. Then she reached out, hand resting against his cheek, thumb brushing a streak of dried sweat. "You should have left this planet days ago. I didn't want to." Her eyes softened. "You should have." "But I didn't." She leaned in and kissed him again, firmer this time, not a question, but an anchor. When she pulled back, her tail looped behind his knees, pulling him subtly closer. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You're mine now, Chester. You understand." He nodded. "Yours." "Then follow me." They left the relay station behind, winds sweeping over the dead as the signal towers finally collapsed under their own weight. The temple wasn't marked on any map, not visible by drone and not broadcast on any frequency. It lived in stories. Grace didn't explain how she knew the path, only that it had been passed down, kept secret, feared, and protected by those who remembered what it once did. The light began to change as they walked, shifting from white to gold to a deep orange that made the sand glow like molten glass. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, the desert opened up before them into a wide canyon choked with spiraled spires of ancient crystal, and at its center stood something impossible. A structure not built by human or beast in hands, angular, towering, alive with silent pulses of energy beneath its surface, like veins beneath skin, the temple. Grace stopped at the edge and exhaled. This is where it all began. Chester looked at it, then at her. Then let's be the ones who end it. The temple stood like a fossilized heartbeat frozen in time, its structure neither stone nor metal, but something in between, smooth and dark with faint greenish veins that pulsed every few seconds like a dormant engine waiting to be called back to life. The air around it hummed low, subtly, as if it were listening. Chester stood beside Grace, both of them gazing at the thing with the kind of reverent dread usually reserved for shipwrecks or tombs. It didn't belong here, not on this planet, not in this desert, and not in any blueprint the Syndicate or Earth had ever documented, and yet it had been here long before either of them arrived, older than war, older than memory, older even than the Beastkin clans that had learned to fear its pulse. Grace didn't speak for a long time. Her gaze didn't waver, but her body was taut, her claws twitching slightly at her sides as if fighting instinct. Chester stepped closer to her, careful not to touch yet, but close enough that she could feel him. Finally, she exhaled and broke the silence. "My grandmother called this place the Echo Core, said it was where dreams went to die." Chester nodded slowly, watching the waves of shimmer that moved across the surface of the temple. "So how do we kill the signal before it spreads?" Grace tilted her head. "We go inside, find the core, rip out whatever the Syndicate planted. And if it's already started broadcasting, then we stop the transmission with our hands if we have to." Chester gave a half smile. "You're not really one for backup plans, are you?" "I had one. He followed me into a temple at the end of the world." The moment settled between them, quiet and heavier than the wind. Her tail brushed his hand, and this time he didn't hesitate. He caught it gently, fingers closing around it as if to ground them both. She gave a soft sound, something between a growl and a hum, and then turned sharply, marching toward the sloped ramp that led into the structure's yawning entrance. He followed without hesitation. Inside, it was like walking into someone else's thoughts. The walls were fluid, not in motion, but somehow responsive. Every footstep echoed too long, too loud, and yet the air remained still. Patterns shimmered faintly in the structure's surfaces, fractals, geometric spirals, and ancient runes that didn't belong to any language Chester recognized. Grace seemed to sense their path more than see it, taking turns that didn't logically connect but still led them deeper, winding through corridors that changed temperature and tone with every level. They descended for what felt like hours before arriving at a chamber unlike the others. It was spherical, perfectly so. The walls pooled in synchronized beats like a heartbeat, and at its center floated a pillar of light that shimmered with encoded data, holographic strands weaving upward like threads of pure thought. Embedded near the top of the room was something else, a Syndicate beacon, half organic, half machine, its shell shaped like a spiked spine twisting around the central stream. "There," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's what they left." Chester stepped forward, scanning the beacon with his wrist module. It's piggybacking on the ancient signal, not overriding it, amplifying it. They found a way to use the temple's resonance to spread the neural override across compatible minds. Grace was already pulling her spear from her back. "Can you disable it?" "Not cleanly. We tear it out. It could trigger a feedback burst, neural burn across the entire sector. Then we find the control link." Chester moved to a console embedded in the curved wall, its interface glowing faintly with strange patterns that seemed to shift under his gaze. As he worked, the lights began to pulse faster, the air thickening. Grace stood with her spear at the ready, eyes scanning the chamber for threats, ears twitching with every subtle change in tone. Then the voice came. Not through sound, but inside their heads, calm, resonant, ancient, and layered with too many tones to belong to one being. It didn't speak words exactly, but feelings, impressions, echoes of ideas that settled into Chester's mind like fog. You enter the cradle, you disturb the weave, you carry contradiction. Harmony cannot bloom in broken soil. Grace staggered slightly but held firm. "Ignore it," she growled. "It's a trick. The core wants to confuse us." Chester grit his teeth, fingers flying across the interface. "I'm in. There's a sequence 6 strands. It's feeding the Syndicate's signal into the deep sleep dream thread. They're not just trying to control behavior, they're trying to rewrite identity. Can you shut it down?" "I can collapse the loop, but if I miscalculate, it could trigger a backlash. Neural recursion could burn you out. Everyone linked to this system." Grace was already moving. "Then you won't miss." She leapt toward the central pillar, her body illuminated by the flickering strands of light. With a single fluid motion, she drove her spear into the Syndicate beacon's upper node, embedding it deep. The chamber screamed, a sharp, vibrating pitch that had no sound, only sensation, like static crawling through the teeth. Chester seized the opening, finishing the sequence, fingers moving faster than thought. The moment the final strand disconnected, the beacon pulsed once, then collapsed inward, folding like crushed bone and vanishing in a puff of synthetic ash. The light in the chamber dimmed, the heartbeat stopped, the voice fell silent. Then the floor buckled. The chamber's walls began to shift, the one static structure now reacting violently, attempting to reset or purge the intrusion. Chester turned to run, but Grace was already hauling him toward a rising slope that hadn't been there seconds ago. They climbed fast, dodging collapsing platforms and bursts of static discharge that lanced out like lightning. The temple was tearing itself apart. They burst through the surface entrance just as the ground behind them cracked open, and the pillar of the temple fell inward with a groan that echoed across the desert. Crystalline sand shot into the air, and for a long moment the entire canyon was silent. Then slowly, it was over. Grace sat on the ridge, breathing hard, staring at the crater where the temple had once stood. Chester dropped beside her, covered in dust, his muscles shaking from the sprint. Neither spoke for a long time. Then Grace turned to him, her eyes glowing faintly again, not with power, but relief. "You did it. We did it." She leaned in, pressing her forehead to his, and he let the contact linger. Her tail wrapped around his waist, and this time it didn't pull him. It held him, not out of habit, but because she wanted to. "No more running," she whispered. "Only forward." They sat there together as the triple moons rose behind the swirling remnants of the fallen temple, and for the first time since arriving on this cursed world, Chester felt like they had taken something back, something sacred. Not just stolen tech or erased data, but choice, freedom, and each other. The sky had shifted by the time they left the crater. The moons hung lower now, casting longer shadows across the desert floor, and the air felt thinner, quieter, like the planet itself was taking a breath after holding it for too long. Grace walked ahead, her gait looser than before, though the tension still sat in her shoulders. Chester followed close behind, both of them moving without hurry now. The temple had been destroyed, the beacon shattered, and whatever signal the syndicate had hoped to spread had been silenced for now. But victory never came clean in a place like this. As they crested another ridge, the outline of an approaching shuttle broke the horizon, its navigation lights blinking softly in the distance. Rescue had come, or so it seemed. Chester squinted against the rising light, pulling his hood forward. "That's not our original extraction ship," he muttered. Grace stopped beside him, narrowed her eyes, and gave a low growl of agreement. The vessel was sleek, armored, and marked with symbols he didn't recognize. Not syndicate, not Earth military either. Something newer, private. "They came fast," Grace said. "Too fast. Someone else was listening." Chester drew his weapon, checking the charge. "You think they're here to collect the scraps? Or finish the job the syndicate started?" The shuttle landed just ahead, sand billowing in thick plumes as the landing struts deployed. The ramp dropped with a mechanical hiss. Two figures stepped down, humanoid armored expressions hidden behind sealed helmets. Grace tensed beside him, tail twitching low. Chester raised his hand, signaling, but neither of the newcomers acknowledged him. One of them scanned the ridge with a wrist-mounted device. The other raised a hand and gestured them forward. Grace stepped in front of Chester, blocking his path. "They don't smell like raiders," she muttered, "but they don't smell like allies either." Chester took a breath and walked forward, stopping several paces from the bottom of the ramp. "Identify yourselves," he called out. "We're authorized salvage and security under Earth Charter. You're trespassing on protected coordinates." The helmeted figure stepped forward. A voice crackled through the speaker, calm, clipped, professional. "We're not here for you. We're here for the device." Chester frowned. "There is no device anymore. It's gone." "Then we're here for you." That was all the warning they got. The second figure raised a weapon, but before the beam could fire, Grace was moving. She launched forward like a coiled spring, claws flashing, spear driving into the chest of the armored attacker. The impact sent the body flying backward, crashing into the side of the shuttle with a metallic crunch. The remaining figure turned to fire, but Chester had already closed the gap, shoulder slamming into the armored gut, knocking the weapon aside. They grappled briefly, Chester twisting under the grip, elbows slamming into the visor, then yanking the helmet loose with both hands. The face that emerged was pale, hairless, synthetic, an enhanced clone unit. The thing grinned. Biological reaction? Impressive. Chester fired point blank into its skull. The clone dropped, twitching once before falling still. Grace returned to his side, panting blood on her forearm, but not hers. "Corporate unit," she said. "Custom modded, didn't smell like syndicate, Earth-based shell, but altered." "They were tracking the signal, too," Chester said, voice low. "Everyone wanted a piece of the tech, even if they had to rip it out of us." Grace turned toward the shuttle's ramp. "We could use the vessel, get off-world before someone worse shows up." "You trust it's not tagged?" She moved to the controls, tearing open the side panel and pulling out a pooling red tracker node. Not anymore. Within minutes, they had the systems online. The ship was newer than anything Chester had flown. Sleek interface, dual-layer nav mesh, high-end stealth drives. Whoever had sent these soldiers hadn't skimped on the budget. Grace took the pilot's seat, flicking switches like she'd flown this exact model before. Chester raised an eyebrow. She glanced back. "We've all got surprises." They lifted off, just as another beacon began pooling on the edge of the horizon, an incoming signal that hadn't been there before. Too far to intercept them now, but it confirmed what they already feared. The destruction of the temple had triggered attention far beyond this world. Whoever owned the override tech had started a race for its fragments. Grace didn't look away from the controls as the desert shrank beneath them. "We need to get this to the archive station," she said. "It's the only neutral ground left that still honors the old treaties. You think they'll listen? They'll have to once they know what's at stake." Chester watched her, eyes trailing over the smudges of blood and sand on her skin, the way her ears tilted slightly toward him even as she focused forward. She was alert, calm, completely in control, but there was something in the way her tail had coiled back around his ankle again, like it refused to forget he was here. He smiled and leaned closer. "We get through this," he said. "What happens after?" She didn't answer right away. Then, softly, "I don't know." "You're planning to vanish into the dunes again?" Her tail squeezed lightly. "Not unless you're beside me." They didn't speak for a while after that. The ship rose through the cloud layer and broke into the upper atmosphere, stars blooming overhead in the darkening sky. Chester leaned back in the co-pilot chair, still holding the data core they had pulled from the temple's shattered vault, scrubbed, corrupted, but not empty. Somewhere inside it, the remnants of the override signal still lingered, pieces of a weapon that could change minds with dreams. The war wasn't over, but they'd taken the first piece off the board. That had to count for something. Grace slowed the ship as it broke into orbital drift, aligning toward the archive station's quadrant. Chester watched her work, admiring the balance in her movements, the discipline in her posture, but more than anything, the softness she tried so hard to hide. He reached over, resting his hand on her arm. She didn't flinch, just looked at him, eyes calm and clear. "Whatever, waiting for us out there," he said. "We face it together." Her voice came low. No running, no lies. Just us. She nodded, and for the first time since the crash, Chester realized something had shifted in both of them. They weren't running anymore. They weren't just surviving. They were building something. Dangerous, maybe temporary, maybe fragile, but real. And for now, that was enough. The archive station floated in orbit like a fortress of knowledge built by ghosts, ancient, massive, and neutral by reputation alone. It had once been the heart of post-war diplomacy, a meeting ground where beast-can clans, human fleets, and splintered outer factions came together under the illusion of peace. Now it was quieter. Mostly scholars, defectors, and outlaws passing through its halls pretending history hadn't taught them how fragile treaties really were. Chester and Grace approached the outer docking ring with the stolen ship on silent protocol, identification ping scrubbed, all weapons locked down. Even so, as they passed through the security field, the ship trembled like it knew it didn't belong. Grace remained in the pilot's seat, posture alert, but her eyes flicked toward Chester more often now. There was no longer hesitation between them, no guarded distance, only quiet understanding, the kind that doesn't need explanation. He felt the same certainty deep in his chest as he looked out at the station's silhouette growing larger by the second. This was it. One last stop. They docked without incident. Archive officers met them at the airlock, weapons holstered but visible, faces concealed behind sterile helmets. Grace stood tall, tail curled low, her expression unreadable. Chester carried the data core they'd recovered, held in a reinforced polymer case designed to prevent signal leakage. They said little as they were escorted down wide halls lined with polished stone and old metal, lit by soft, artificial daylight that tried too hard to feel natural. The delegates waiting at the Central Council chamber represented the last fragments of a unified galaxy, one human, one beast-can elder, one from the neutral bloc, all of them older than the current wars and twice as suspicious. They asked no formal questions, only nodded as Chester placed the case on the table and opened it. The moment the data activated, the chamber dimmed slightly. Grace stepped forward. The syndicate didn't just hold, pooling waveforms and brief flickers of corrupted neural maps. The beast-can elder stiffened. The human delegate frowned. Only the neutral representative, an aging archivist with cybernetic implants laced along her temples, spoke. This is real." Chester nodded. "What's left of it?" Grace stepped forward. The syndicate didn't just unlock the override, they tried to spread it through dreams, through memories. If we hadn't stopped it, the war wouldn't be fought with weapons anymore. It would be fought in the mind. The human delegate cleared his throat. "You expect us to take this at face value?" Two rogue operatives arriving with a stolen shuttle and corrupted data, claiming you've single-handedly dismantled a syndicate prod this. And if what you say is everything we've rebuilt. Chester leaned forward, voice steady. "We didn't come to be believed. We came to stop a war." The beast-can elder rose slowly. You say the source was destroyed. Grace nodded, buried. We tore the last node from its root. There was a long silence before the archivist stepped closer and placed a hand gently on the console. We'll verify this, and if what you say is true, you've prevented a disaster that would have consumed far more than this quadrant. The delegates dispersed to review the data, but the point was made. Word would spread. The story would be picked apart, doubted, politicized, but it would stand. The override tech had been stopped before it could spread, and now the archive held the fragments under watch. Grace and Chester left the chamber without waiting for approval or medals or promises. None of that mattered. Not anymore. They stood at the overlook of the station's observation deck, watching the stars outside rotate gently past the glass. Grace leaned against the railing, her armor partially removed, her fur still dusted with the memory of the desert. Chester stood beside the fabric of his sleeve. So what happens now? She asked, voice quiet. The vaults, the temple, all of it compressed into the last few brutal days. Every piece of it had led here. And so had she. Grace shifted closer, her tail brushing lightly against his leg again, but this time she didn't pretend it was accidental. Her hand rested on his arm, fingers curling around the fabric of his sleeve. So what happens now? She asked, voice quiet. Chester exhaled slowly. We stop running. We figure out what life looks like when you're not constantly one step away from dying. She turned to him, a hint of a smile on her lips. You mean we get boring? He chuckled. We earned boring. She moved even closer, resting her forehead against his shoulder, letting the tension finally ease out of her body. I don't know what that life looks like, she admitted. I've never had one that wasn't duty or war or survival. Then let's build it together, he said. Slowly, somewhere quiet, somewhere you don't need to sleep with one eye open. Her arms wrapped around him fully then, and he pulled her close, her warmth grounding him more than any weapon or oath ever had. The station moved quietly around them, voices of travelers and officers fading into white noise behind the glass. Out there in the stars, someone would always be planning the next fight, the next claim, the next edge, but not them, not anymore. Chester lowered his head slightly, voice low and steady. You said once your tail wraps on instinct that it doesn't mean anything. She looked up, eyes glowing faintly in the low light. I lied. I know. And then he kissed her. Not tentative, not stolen, but deliberate, a closing of distance that had never really been there. Her claws tightened gently at his back. Her tail looped around his leg, holding him still, like she'd finally decided where she belonged. And this time she didn't pull away. There would be no more outposts, no more raids, no more vaults full of half-dead secrets, just them, and the choice they'd made. When they left the station a few days later, it wasn't under stealth. It was still slept on his chest, and her tail never let go. People, one human, one beastkin, climbing aboard a civilian freighter with their gear packed, their names cleared and their destination unknown. No orders, no commanders, just open space in the promise of a life they'd earned the hard way. And every night after that, no matter where they landed, no matter what storms they passed through, she still slept on his chest, and her tail never let go.